Kiana Morris walked down Harbrook Avenue alone, shoes squeaking with each weary step. The low hum of flickering streetlights illuminated the worn pavement and graffiti-tagged walls. She clutched a small wad of tips in her jacket pocket, counting under her breath to see if she'd met her savings goal for college applications. Each coin and crumpled dollar bill told the story of her shift at Brianna's diner, burnt fingertips from a fryer, a tray full of dishes that never seemed to end, and an ever-hopeful smile she gave each customer to earn just a bit more in tips. For a moment, she paused under a buzzing neon sign advertising a shuttered pawn shop. Her reflection glimmered in the pawn shop window, tired brown eyes, her hair pinned in a fraying bun, her black work pants stained with cooking grease. She checked her phone, past midnight. Her mom, Deborah, had warned her about staying too late, but the dinner crowd's tips had been too good to leave early. In just a few more weeks of shifts like this, she'd have enough for all her application fees, maybe even a little extra for some new clothes before freshman orientation, if she got in anywhere. She closed her eyes, picturing her dream campus, the library towers, the wide green lawns. It felt close enough to touch. A sudden glare of headlights turned the corner, illuminating the sidewalk and casting Kiana's shadow in elongated, ghostly lines across the pavement. Her heart did a tiny flip. Usually she was comforted by the sight of a patrol car. She'd grown up trusting that uniform, that badge. But something about the way this cruiser slowed as it approached made her stomach tighten. The police cruiser stopped a few yards behind her, engine grumbling. She quickened her pace, hoping it would roll on. But her feet barely got her 5 steps farther before the piercing wail of sirens shattered the night stillness. Red and blue lights pulsed across the dark buildings, flickering in the corner of her vision. "Hands where we can see them," a voice barked over the loudspeaker. The blunt command caused an instant chill to run through Kiana, sharper than the crisp autumn wind. She turned, raising her palms to shoulder height. Her breath caught in her throat. 2 officers leapt from the car. One, tall and broad with a scowl set deep into his face, aimed his weapon directly at her. Her instincts screamed to drop to the pavement, but she managed to keep standing, arms still raised. "Get on the ground," the second officer hollered, voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Aye," she stammered, feet glued to the sidewalk. "I'm just heading home from work." But they rushed her, the tall officer grabbing her arm, twisting it behind her back and slamming her onto the hood of the cruiser. The metal was cold and unyielding, the edges digging into her ribs. She gasped in pain, her chest constricted, so tight she almost forgot how to breathe. "This is her all right," said the other cop as he rummaged through her bag, flinging out her diner uniform and the meager roll of tips she'd been counting. She saw coins scatter across the asphalt with metallic pings, and the sorrow of each lost penny gripped her. Suspect matches the description. Armed robbery on Hallow Street, less than 3 blocks away. No, I haven't. You can check with my boss," Kiana pleaded. "I was at Brianna's diner all night." Neither officer seemed to care. The tall one yanked her from the hood and forced her hands into tight metal cuffs. The sound of them snapping into place felt eerily final, like a cell door slamming shut. The drive to the precinct was a blur, tears mixing with the swirling lights outside the cruiser's window. Kiana felt an ache in her chest, partly from fear and partly from the impression that her entire life was being stolen from her in a single brutal moment. The booking area reeked of disinfectant and stale coffee. Bright fluorescent lights blared overhead, exposing every stain on the worn linoleum floors. Lines of exhausted-looking people, some handcuffed like her, some in street clothes, waited for processing. Kiana's arms were stiff from being twisted behind her for so long. She nearly crumpled when they finally removed the handcuffs, only for a female officer to bark at her to stand still for a pat-down. Plastic bins swallowed up her personal belongings. Her phone, house keys, the last $5 in tips she hadn't stuffed deep in her coat pocket. A camera flash left her blinking away spots as they took her mugshot. Then they ushered her to the fingerprint station. The black ink on her fingertips felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. After what felt like hours, she was led past rows of cells. Cold stares greeted her from behind bars. Some eyes were curious, others vacant with defeat. Finally, the officer shoved her into an empty cell, the clang of the barred door echoing down the corridor, making her flinch. She sank onto the metal bench in shock. One phone call she remembered from all those TV shows. I'm supposed to get one call. The reality was that no one seemed in a hurry to grant her that right. As the overhead lights buzzed, her mind repeated the same frantic refrain. I didn't do anything. Why won't they listen? Dawn broke over the city as Keanu was led from the holding cell to a cramped meeting room, where a weary-eyed public defender introduced himself as Armand Price. His hair stuck out in frantic tufts, as though he'd slept on it. They're accusing you of armed robbery, he said, rummaging through a disorganized briefcase. The alleged victim picked you out of a photo lineup. That's impossible, Keanu replied, hugging her arms around herself. I was at work all night. Please, you can talk to my manager, my coworkers. We can bring that up at the hearing, he said, flipping through some papers. But just so you know, these things can be difficult. He wouldn't meet her eyes. It was like he'd already decided how the story would end. The hearing took place in a courtroom so cold and sterile it reminded Keanu of a hospital waiting room. Judge George Malloy presided, balding, with deep lines etched across his forehead. He projected a folksy smile that never reached his eyes. The clock on the wall read 8:02 a.m. as the bailiff announced the case number, State versus Keanu Morris. The prosecutor, a man with slicked back hair, stood. He spoke with a brisk confidence. Your Honor, the suspect threatened the victim with a firearm, forcibly stole valuables, and fled. The charges include armed robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. His tone was clipped, as if reading from a script he'd memorized 100 times. I never, Keanu tried to interject, but her lawyer gently tugged at her sleeve. Judge Malloy fixed Keanu with a hard stare, then looked at her public defender. Mr. Price cleared his throat. We'd like to request more time to gather character witnesses and to retrieve surveillance footage from the diner. Malloy cut him off with a dismissive wave. The identification is strong. The alleged victim claims to have recognized her in broad daylight. The state's evidence is compelling enough to proceed. Keanu's mother, Deborah Morris, sat in the second row, tears streaking her cheeks. Keanu's 13-year-old sister, Nicole, clutched Deborah's arm, wide eyes darting from the judge to Keanu. That sight alone nearly broke Keanu's composure. Her father, Ray Morris, was conspicuously absent, away on a work trip, or so they thought. If only he were here. Then came the sentencing. The public defender's pleas for a reduced bail or time to gather evidence fell on deaf ears. Judge Malloy barely suppressed a smirk as he pronounced his verdict. I am remanding the accused to juvenile detention until trial. Deborah screamed, a raw sound torn from her soul. No, she's innocent. This is a mistake. Two bailiffs seized Keanu by the arms. One twisted her wrist, painfully, as if in warning. She flinched, tears burning her cheeks. Nicole, cheeks wet with tears, scrambled through her mother's handbag, yanked out a cell phone, and punched in a number with trembling fingers. Dad, you have to come, she sobbed into the receiver. They took Keanu. The entire courtroom seemed to hush. Even Judge Malloy's smug expression faltered. The words "they took Keanu" hung in the air like a thundercloud about to erupt with lightning. Ray Morris had been in Washington, D.C., finalizing a major legal initiative. As the U.S. Attorney General, his schedule rarely allowed time for spontaneity. But the moment he heard Nicole's frightened voice, everything changed. He ended his meeting without apology, ignoring the offended looks from a half-dozen officials. Within the hour, he boarded a plane heading back to the city where Keanu was being held. At the courthouse, Ray barged into Judge Malloy's chambers without waiting for a formal invitation, flanked by two associates from his legal team. Malloy looked up from a stack of papers, eyes narrowing at the intrusion. Judge Malloy, Ray greeted, voice trembling with a mix of anger and barely contained fear. I believe you have my daughter in custody on bogus charges. Mr. Morris, Malloy replied, a note of condescension in his tone. I wasn't aware you had a personal connection to the suspect. This is highly irregular. You think I care about your protocol? Ray shot back. Where's the evidence? My daughter was working at Brianna's diner, 5 miles from the alleged crime scene. That diner is near an intersection with no cameras. The victim's statement is enough to hold her. Malloy folded his hands as if in prayer. It's within the law, and I trust due process will handle the situation. Ray advanced a step, fury etched into every line of his face. Let me be perfectly clear. You keep my child locked up without real evidence, and I will use every resource at my disposal to uncover exactly what's going on in your courtroom. Malloy's mouth twitched, but he maintained his outward calm. Be my guest, Attorney General. But right now, your daughter remains in juvenile detention. We'll see if she can prove her innocence when trial commences. Outside, the corridor was buzzing with attorneys and clerks, all pretending not to eavesdrop. Ray stood there a moment, letting the confrontation settle into his bones. He felt something new crystallize inside him, a savage, parental protectiveness that overshadowed his usual diplomatic approach. He fished out his phone, speaking into it as soon as someone on the other end picked up. Get me everything on Malloy. His finances, his rulings, his connections, everything. Meanwhile, an ominous gray bus rumbled up to the gates of Western Horizon Juvenile Center. Its tires kicked up gravel as it parked by tall fences crowned with razor wire. Kiana sat inside, wrists cuffed, staring at her warped reflection in the scratched bus window. The mechanical hiss of the doors opening made her pulse spike. She clutched the seat, inhaling the stale air that smelled of spilled soda and fear. Everybody out, barked a guard, stepping into the aisle. Kiana shuffled off the bus, ankles shackled, legs stiff from the ride. The yard outside was heartbreakingly bleak, a rectangle of concrete, ringed by fencing. Patches of scrub grass poked through cracks, but otherwise it was all lifeless. A group of teenage girls in identical gray sweatsuits stared as Kiana passed, their eyes calculating. One, tall and heavily tattooed on her arms, gave a slow shake of the head, as if warning Kiana, "You don't want to be here." Inside, the intake process at Western Horizon was a relentless march of indignities. The guards confiscated Kiana's clothes, handing her a drab uniform that felt rough against her skin. Cold fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they conducted a medical exam. Just more scrutiny, more violation. She tried to keep her chin high, but tears threatened to choke her at every step. Warden Lester Norris greeted her with a thin-lipped smile that never touched his eyes. "Ah, our new arrival. I've heard we have ourselves an important case here," he said, making air quotes around important. "We treat all detainees the same, Miss Morris, no matter who their daddy is." His words radiated contempt. Kiana balled her fists to keep from shaking. The idea that her father's status as U.S. Attorney General would do her more harm here was a bitter irony. They led her to a cramped 2-person cell that smelled of sweat and mildew. Her roommate, a wiry girl with short braids, introduced herself as Amanda. She looked Kiana up and down, offered a faint nod, then went back to reading a tattered library book. "That top bunk's free," Amanda said. "Climb on up. Lights go out at 9. Oh, and keep out of Trixie's way in the common area. She likes to pick fights." Kiana swallowed, noticing the bruise on Amanda's cheek. She found a silent corner of the room to compose herself. The metal bunk creaked ominously when she tested its ladder. "This can't be real," she thought. "I was working at the diner. How did my life turn upside down in one night?" That question haunted her through dinner, a tray of lukewarm stew that no one would dare call appetizing, and lingered as she tried to sleep on the stiff mattress, every muscle in her body sore from stress. She closed her eyes to the background sounds of girls weeping, guards yelling, and a faint, pulsing hum from overhead lights that never fully turned off. Call to action /midpoint. If you're still here watching, and I hope you are, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with friends. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt powerless in a system that seems rigged. Or just drop some encouragement for Kiana. She needs all the support she can get. Now back to our story. Ray Morris spent the next days locked in his home office, the walls lined with heavy law books and legal case files. Deborah hovered near the door, bringing trays of food that mostly went untouched. She'd never seen her husband this consumed, not even during his toughest political battles. Stacks of documents were piled high on his mahogany desk. Judge Malloy's financial records, transcripts of prior juvenile cases, and logs of Malloy's sentencing decisions. One chart in particular caught Ray's eye. A bar graph showing that Malloy sentenced black juveniles to significantly higher prison terms, even for lesser offenses. The disparity was glaring. "This isn't random," Ray muttered to David Reese, his senior legal advisor. "Malloy's funneling kids into the system, as if they're a commodity. I suspect a private partnership with the detention centers, like Western Horizon." David nodded, flipping through a binder. "We'll dig deeper. There's a rumor about Malloy investing in local private facilities. If that's true, he's getting a financial kickback for every occupant." A quiet knock interrupted them. Deborah stepped inside, her voice trembling. "Ray, there's a journalist named Paula Hayes on the phone. Says she has evidence of Malloy's involvement with something called the Stonehurst Initiative, some contract that might tie private investors to juvenile sentencing." He shot to his feet. "Patch her through." Paula Hayes was concise. She'd uncovered emails between Malloy and the Stonehurst Investment Group. They discussed youth bed quotas, a chilling phrase that suggested children were reduced to profit statistics. With each revelation, Ray felt righteous anger fuse with fatherly desperation. "We're taking this public," he told Deborah and David once the call ended. "We blow it wide open on national news if we have to." At Western Horizon, Keanu awoke to a guard rattling her cell door. "Rise and shine, Morris. You've got laundry duty." Her arms ached from a poor night's sleep, and she suspected a bruise forming along her ribs. She forced herself off the bunk, eyes gritty, mind thick with dread. In the laundry room, the air was heavy with steam. Rows of industrial machines droned, churning so loudly that conversation was almost impossible. Amanda worked beside her, methodically folding the facility's dull gray linens. Between the swirling steam clouds, Keanu glimpsed the guard stationed near the door, Officer Fulmer. He had a habit of glaring at her whenever she slowed down. "Don't let them see you slacking," Amanda whispered. "They'll find any excuse to." "Hey," Officer Fulmer shouted, stepping closer. "Keep talking. I'll have you both scrubbing floors in the bathrooms." Keanu pressed her lips shut, focusing on the monotonous task of feeding sheets into the dryer. But her mind churned with thoughts of her father. Was he out there fighting for her? Or had Malloy made it impossible? Back in the cell later that evening, she found a slip of paper near her bunk. In scribbled handwriting, it read, "I heard you're the AG's daughter. Be careful. People here want to teach you a lesson." Her heart pounded. She glanced around to see who might have left it, but no one made eye contact. Ray's press conference took place on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing like a swarm of fireflies as reporters jostled for position. He stood before a podium, Deborah by his side, Nicole clutching her mother's hand. The worry lines on Deborah's face spoke volumes. She'd rather be anywhere else, but she'd do whatever it took for her daughter. "Judge George Malloy is engaged in a pattern of discriminatory sentencing," Ray declared, voice booming over the crowd. "We have documented evidence linking him to private prison investors." Whispers rippled through the throng of media personnel. A reporter from Channel 5 News raised her microphone. "Attorney General Morris, are you saying Malloy receives bribes for each juvenile he sentences?" "I'm saying we have records that strongly suggest financial gain tied to his rulings. And my daughter, Keanu Morris, is one of his latest victims." Questions flew, but Ray kept his answers measured. He turned each question into a broader condemnation of corruption. The story was no longer just about Keanu. It was about countless kids, mostly black and brown, sent away by Malloy without due process or real evidence. That evening, the headline screamed, "Juvenile Court Scandal. Judge accused of racist motives and private prison ties." Social media lit up, demanding an investigation into Malloy's entire backlog of cases. For the first time, the public eye was laser-focused on a crooked judge who had operated in the shadows for years. In the warden's office at Western Horizon, Lester Norris paced behind his desk. A small television in the corner replayed footage of Ray's press conference. The warden's lips thinned to a hard line as he muted the volume. He dialed a number on his landline phone, a relic that rarely rang. "Judge Malloy," he said, "we need to talk. That spotlight you've drawn, my facility can't handle that kind of scrutiny." A tense silence crackled. Then Malloy's voice came through, raspy with anger. "Keep her in line. Understand me? Lock her down if you have to. But your center's not squeaky clean. If they dig too deep, you'll have your own set of troubles. Control the situation." Immediately, Warden Norris hung up, shaking his head. He rifled through a desk drawer and pulled out a file labeled Morris, Keanu. After flipping through a few pages, he pressed the intercom on his phone. "Get Officer Fulmer and bring him in here." Moments later, Fulmer appeared, muscular arms folded, eyes glittering with sadistic curiosity. "Yes, sir?" Norris tapped the file. "I need you to send a message. She's becoming a poster child. We can't let her get too comfortable." A cruel smile tugged at Fulmer's lips. "Understood." A harsh wind whipped across the exercise yard the next afternoon. The yard was about half the size of a high school basketball court, enclosed by chain-link fences. Keanu stood on the edges, trying to keep a low profile as groups of girls congregated in corners. Some traded cigarettes or contraband items under the guards' watchful eyes. She heard footsteps thudding on the concrete behind her. Before she could turn around, a heavy blow slammed into her back, knocking the wind out of her. She hit the ground hard, scraping her palms. A ring of curious onlookers formed. One of them, Trixie, the tall, tattooed girl from earlier, stepped up, cracking her knuckles. "Think you're too good for us because your dad's some big shot?" Keanu's heart hammered. "I never said that," she managed, voice trembling. "I'm just trying to do my time." Trixie slammed a fist into Keanu's side, sending a bolt of pain through her ribs. Gasping, Keanu curled into a defensive ball. Amanda stood at the perimeter, eyes wide with panic, but she didn't dare intervene. Suddenly, the crowd parted as Officer Fulmer barged in. For a fleeting moment, Keanu felt relief, until she saw the expression on his face. He didn't look like a rescuer. He looked like a predator who discovered easy prey. Fulmer hauled Keanu to her feet by her collar, ignoring her choked cries. "Trying to start a fight?" he snarled for the crowd's benefit. "Is that it?" "What?" "No." Keanu gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks from both pain and disbelief. Without warning, Fulmer slammed her against the chain-link fence, rattling it so loud the entire yard went silent. She coughed and tasted blood. Trixie backed away, eyes darting left and right as though she'd realized her own vulnerability. Fulmer pressed his forearm against Keanu's neck. "You speak one word about this to anyone," he whispered, quiet enough that only Keanu could hear, "and your father won't be able to protect you from what'll happen next." He let go, and Keanu slumped to the concrete, trembling. In the hushed yard, the only sound was her ragged breathing. A second guard, Officer Chong, stepped forward as if on cue and pulled Keanu up by the arm, ignoring her limp attempts to stand on her own. "You're going to solitary," Chong announced blandly, like reading from a script. The yard watchers parted, and the group escorted Keanu away. She glanced back at Amanda, who gave her a pained, helpless look that said it all. "We can't fight them." Solitary confinement was a small, windowless cell that smelled of mold and sour sweat. A single low-watt bulb illuminated cracked walls marked with graffiti scratched by countless previous occupants. There was a thin mattress on a concrete slab and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. No sheets, no blankets. Keanu's ribs ached with each breath, and a warm trickle along her face told her she had a cut near her temple. She ran her fingers over it, wincing as they came away sticky with blood. The door clanged shut behind her with heavy finality, and the tiny slot for food trays was slammed shut. In the oppressive darkness, she felt a wave of desperation rise within. She pressed trembling hands against her mouth to stifle sobs. Her father's words replayed in her memory. "They can't take what's inside you, Keanu." But as she curled up in that silent tomb, she felt a terrifying thought creep in. What if they already have? She lost track of time, minutes, hours, maybe days. Without windows, her sense of reality frayed. Sometimes she talked to herself to keep from unraveling. She repeated math equations, recited lines from favorite poems, anything to stay grounded. At some point, a small tray of stale bread and water slid through the slot. Her stomach growled, but the smell turned it sour. She forced down a few bites, if only to stave off the worst of her hunger. The cold seeped into her bones, and exhaustion eventually pulled her into a fitful, nightmare-laced sleep. Outside the detention center, protests gathered steam. Activists, college students, and outraged parents stood by the main gates holding signs reading, "Free our youth," and "Private detention quotas," and "Justice for Keanu." News cameras captured Ray Morris addressing the crowd with a megaphone. "We must stop allowing unscrupulous judges to trade our children's futures for profit. The people demand an investigation into every one of Judge Malloy's rulings." Behind him, Deborah and Nicole held pictures of Keanu. Their faces were etched with hope and anxiety. Journalists from major networks were there, broadcasting the story nationwide. A gentle breeze carried the hum of combined voices chanting for reform. Inside the warden's office, Norris watched through a security monitor, face twisted in annoyance. "Damn troublemakers," he muttered. His phone buzzed. Another call from Malloy, no doubt. While Keanu struggled in solitary, Ray's legal team discovered a crucial piece of footage, a corner store security video from the night of the robbery. It clearly showed two different suspects, neither one even remotely resembling Keanu, taking part in the alleged armed robbery. Ray held the USB drive as if it were the Holy Grail. "This proves she was misidentified. Why didn't the police find this earlier?" David Reese frowned. "We suspect Malloy's influence kept the real footage buried. But it was archived on a server the cops never requested. The store owner gave us full access." Ray slammed a hand on the table, adrenaline surging. "Let's get an emergency injunction. With this evidence, we can free Keanu immediately." But the path to justice was anything but smooth. Judge Malloy had allies all over the local court system. Every time Ray's team filed for an expedited hearing, it was lost or delayed in bureaucratic mire. Key officials were suspiciously on vacation, or their phones stopped working. Even the state's attorney general office seemed to drag its feet, the same office Ray once trusted to cooperate with him. "It's corruption at every turn," Paula Hayes, the journalist, told him. She had just published a damning expose tying Malloy to Stonehurst's private youth detention investments. They're doubling down, trying to cover their tracks. Still, Ray pressed on. He had the truth on his side, and a father's love fueling his fight. The next step was to release the store footage to the national news. If local courts blocked him, he'd let the entire country see Malloy's wrongdoing. Eventually, the mounting public pressure and damning evidence could no longer be ignored. A federal judge agreed to hear the emergency motion on Keanu's case. The day of the hearing arrived quickly, too quickly for Malloy to fully shield himself. In a federal courtroom, far grander and more imposing than Malloy's local domain, Keanu was brought in wearing a borrowed blouse and slacks that Deborah had managed to deliver. She looked thin, with shadows under her eyes, but her posture was resolute. Ray almost buckled when he saw her. He'd only been allowed one brief visitation, barely enough time to hold her hands and tell her to keep faith. Now she stood in front of him, bruised but unbroken. The bailiff motioned for Keanu to sit on one side, while Ray and his legal team took seats on the other. Malloy, for the first time, was not on the bench, but at the defense table with a fancy private attorney. The federal judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Honorable Rebecca Lundgren, called the court to order. Her crisp tone sliced through the tension. "I have reviewed the preliminary evidence. Mr. Morris, you may present your case." Ray's chief counsel rose, playing the corner store footage for all to see. The grainy black and white video showed two perpetrators, clearly not Keanu, stealing cash at gunpoint. The timestamp matched perfectly with the alleged robbery. Gasps rippled through the spectators. Then Paula Hayes took the stand, explaining her investigation into Malloy's financial ties. She detailed a nauseating pattern. Juveniles given maximum sentences while Malloy's investment account with Stonehurst grew. The correlation was impossible to ignore. A hush settled as Judge Lundgren turned to Malloy. "Do you have any explanation for this newly surfaced footage and these financial records?" Malloy's attorney stammered about procedural misunderstandings, but the judge's stony expression never wavered. She turned to Keanu, her gaze softer. "Young lady, you have been wrongfully accused. Based on the overwhelming evidence, this court vacates all charges against you with immediate effect." The words felt like fresh air to Keanu. Tears streamed down Deborah's face. Nicole muffled a cheer in her mother's coat. Ray let out a long-held breath, blinking rapidly to keep his composure. The bailiff undid the shackles around Keanu's wrists, and they clattered to the ground with a resonant clang. The sound of an unjust burden lifted. But the hearing wasn't over. Judge Lundgren faced Malloy again. "As for you, we have sufficient cause to launch a federal investigation into misconduct and corruption. This court is issuing an order for your immediate suspension from the bench, pending further legal proceedings." Malloy's face turned ashen, mouth opening and closing without sound. Cameras flashed wildly as the once invincible judge realized he'd lost everything in a single, humiliating hour. Keanu turned to Ray and collapsed into his arms, the sob she'd held back for months finally breaking free. "I'm out. I'm really out." The rest of her family crowded around, hugging and crying, a tight unit that had been battered but never broken. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters clamored for interviews. Microphones sprouted like weeds, thrust toward Keanu. She tried to speak, but was overwhelmed by the swirl of questions. "Ms. Morris, how does it feel to be free? Do you plan to sue?" "Attorney General Morris, can you comment on Malloy's arrest?" Ray lifted a hand to calm them. "We just want to celebrate Keanu's release right now. But rest assured, this is only the beginning of a much larger fight to dismantle a system that allowed a corrupt judge to thrive." Keanu caught sight of a picket sign in the crowd that read, "Justice for all our children." An older woman holding it waved in solidarity. That moment seared into Keanu's mind, a reminder that she wasn't alone and that many others still needed help. Malloy's downfall happened swiftly. The exposés continued. More families came forward, recounting stories of their children serving absurdly harsh sentences under his gavel. The FBI began raiding the offices of Stonehurst Initiative, uncovering shocking email chains about meeting youth occupancy targets. Each revelation hammered another nail in the coffin of Malloy's legacy. Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office, led by Ray and a newly invigorated staff, launched a wide-reaching review of juvenile sentencing in the state. Private detention centers scrambled to distance themselves from a scandal, but many faced their own lawsuits and federal probes. Warden Norris at Western Horizon soon found himself answering tough questions about guard misconduct. Subpoenas rained down. Back at the Morris home, Keanu was greeted with a surprise party organized by Deborah and Nicole. Balloons, homemade cupcakes, and a big sign that read, "Welcome home." The living room was warm, scented by Deborah's cooking. The same space Keanu remembered so well. The worn couch, the family photos, now felt new, like a safe haven. She sank onto that couch in disbelief. Just days ago, she'd been in solitary, shivering under flickering lights. Nicole jumped onto her lap, hugging her fiercely. "I missed you so much," she said, voice muffled by tears and laughter. "Me too," Keanu whispered, stroking her sister's hair. So much." Deborah hurried from the kitchen with more plates of food. "Baby, eat something. You've lost weight. They hardly feed you in those places. We need to fatten you up again." Her eyes glistened as she fussed, torn between relief and anger for what had happened. Ray leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You know, Keanu, you don't have to talk to the press if you're not ready. They'll keep calling, but it's your choice." She nodded slowly, letting the comfort of home wash over her. "I will talk, Dad," she said after a moment. "Just not today. Today, I just want to breathe." Days turned into weeks. The nightmares of Western Horizon receded, though not entirely. Keanu would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced she still felt the scratchy uniform against her skin or heard the clang of cell doors. Each time, she'd calm herself by looking around her bedroom with its pink curtains and posters of her favorite music artists. She made a silent vow, "I'll make sure no one else goes through what I did." That vow crystallized one morning when she received a letter from Amanda, her old cellmate. It had been smuggled out of Western Horizon and contained lines that made Keanu's heart lurch. "Things got worse after you left. Officer Fulmer is taking out his anger on anyone who talks back. Warden Norris introduced stricter rules. We need help." Keanu showed the letter to Ray. He exhaled, jaw set. "I suspected as much. Malloy's done, but the system he used is still churning." Together, father and daughter reached out to civil rights organizations, planning a class action lawsuit against private detention centers like Western Horizon. Paula Hayes wrote a series of hard-hitting articles, quoting Keanu about her experiences. More former inmates came forward with testimonies of abuse, forging a movement that demanded reform. Keanu also found an ally in Trixie, the same girl who'd attacked her under Fulmer's watch. Trixie's letter offered a sobering explanation. "They forced me. Said I'd face solitary if I didn't teach you a lesson." "I'm sorry." That letter was a turning point, reminding Keanu that the real villains were the ones orchestrating brutality from positions of power. If this story has moved you, remember to hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us how you feel about these injustices. Share this video so more people can learn the truth. Now let's see how it all wraps up. The class action suit landed in federal court. Keanu attended the proceedings, not as a defendant, but as a key witness. Her testimony provided a first-hand account of the horrors within Western Horizon. She described the cold solitary cell, the guards' intimidation, the medical neglect. Paula Hayes published blow-by-blow updates, while the public flooded social media with demands to shut down such facilities. Warden Norris was called to the stand. His usual confident posture looked deflated under cross-examination. When confronted with internal emails referencing profitable expansions and higher occupancy rates, he stumbled through half-hearted defenses. Meanwhile, attorneys unveiled audits showing how children's sentences correlated with spikes in his facility's monthly revenue. The tension peaked when Trixie testified via video call from inside Western Horizon. Tears glistened as she recounted how officers coerced inmates into fights to create disciplinary infractions, justifying extended sentences. She apologetically pointed out her own assault on Keanu as a prime example. The cross-examination fell flat. No one could refute the pattern of abuse. Judge Delgado, overseeing the federal case, listened with growing outrage. In his final statement, he declared the private detention's practices unconstitutional, ordering a full-scale investigation into every youth facility in the region. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears of relief. Keanu left the courthouse that day feeling an unburdening in her chest, like she could finally inhale fully without the weight of fear. She found Ray standing by the marble steps, looking out at the jubilant crowd of families and activists. He turned, gave Keanu a tired smile. "We've still got a lot of work to do," he said. "Always," she replied, interlacing her fingers with his. "But at least now we can do it together." Months later, Keanu walked across the campus of Hawthorne University, holding a fresh acceptance letter to their pre-law program. The midday sun warmed her face as she passed tall, ivy-covered buildings. Students lounged on the grassy quad, flipping through textbooks or chatting on laptops. She paused for a moment to close her eyes and soak in the freedom of simply being there. A swirl of memories replayed in her mind. The cold bench of her holding cell, the echo of a judge's gavel, the sting of peppery tears on her cheeks. Each flashback was a reminder of how easily injustice could swallow someone whole. Yet, here she was free, determined, and about to become a lawyer who could fight back on behalf of others. She met with her academic advisor, discussing course loads and extracurriculars that aligned with juvenile justice reform. Every subject she tackled, constitutional law, ethics, criminal procedure, felt like an armor she was forging to protect other kids from Malloy-like figures. After her meeting, she found an empty bench near a fountain. The gentle gurgling of the water soothed her. She took out her phone to check messages. Among the usual flood of congratulatory texts from high school friends was a new email alert from Paula Hayes. Breaking. Malloy sentenced to 20 years for corruption. Keanu let that sink in. The man who tried to steal her life away would spend 2 decades behind bars. She forwarded the news to Amanda and Trixie, both of whom she kept in touch with. Then she tapped out a single sentence in reply to Paula. "This is a victory for all of us, but we won't stop here." Smiling, she locked her phone and looked toward the horizon. Sunlight danced on the fountain spray, reminding her that, despite the darkness she'd faced, there was always light to be found. This place, this moment, was her new beginning. And that, folks, is the story of how one courageous young woman refused to bow to a corrupted system. Remember, your voice can make a difference. No matter how big the institutions are, change starts with people who refuse to be silenced. Drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Share this story to spread hope and rally others to stand up against injustice. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next incredible story. If you enjoyed Keanu's battle for justice, don't miss our next video. I've handpicked another powerful tale of triumph over adversity. Click here to watch it now.